tombs carved into towering cliffs, temples perched on the edges of precipices. And it does not stop there. There is even a lighthouse built on top of a narrow volcanic rock formation. But how was that even possible? And could a lighthouse keeper truly survive in a place like that? In today's video, we are going to show you that not even the most extreme geographical challenges were capable of limiting human creativity. Many of these constructions are difficult to believe, especially when we consider the era in which they were built. But before we continue, let me ask you something. What is the most random and improbable construction you have ever seen or heard about? Ancient tombs of Dalian. You have probably seen a tomb before, but I doubt you have ever seen anything like this. There is a stretch of coastline in southwestern Turkey where the mountains look as if they had been violently opened by human hands. In Dalian, the cliffs carry geometric scars carved more than 2,000 years ago. The ancient tombs of the region are not hidden beneath the ground. They watch everything from above, like petrified faces staring eternally at the river. The first time I saw this landscape, I had the impression that the mountains were hollow. Not because of their physical appearance, but because of the strange feeling that something still remained inside them. Those tombs were built by the Lycians, an ancient people who existed long before Roman domination took over Anatolia. The Lycians had an unusual relationship with death. They believed the dead needed to remain elevated in order to reach the heavens more easily. Because of that, they carved burial chambers directly into the rock walls, transforming entire mountains into suspended funerary cities above the water. The most disturbing detail is that many of those tombs were designed to resemble small houses or temples. The dead were not placed into simple holes. They received monumental facades, carved columns, and entrances designed to impress anyone passing through the valley. The most famous group in the region is known as the Tombs of Kaunos. They are carved into the hillsides above the Dalian River, silently watching the tourist boats that slowly cross the green waters below. There is something deeply unsettling about that contrast between modern tourism and ancient silence. Kaunos was an extremely important city during antiquity. Its location allowed control over trade routes between the Mediterranean and the interior of Anatolia. Merchants, soldiers, and sailors passed through the area for centuries, leaving behind enough wealth to finance gigantic funerary constructions. The most elaborate tombs belonged to the Lycian elite. Kings, rulers, and influential families competed through the grandeur of their own burial sites. On some facades, it is still possible to see marks left by ancient tools, as if the workers had abandoned the site only yesterday. I find it astonishing to imagine the amount of effort required to build something like that. There were no modern machines, hydraulic cranes, or electric equipment. Men climbed dangerous rock faces, carrying simple tools, carving limestone beneath a brutal heat that dominates the region during much of the year. The architecture of these tombs combines Greek influence with local Lycian traditions. Some entrances resemble classical Hellenic temples, while others look completely unique. It is precisely this cultural mixture that makes Dalian so different from other archaeological sites in Turkey. Many archaeologists believe part of the tombs were looted even during antiquity. Gold, jewelry, and funerary objects disappeared centuries ago. Even so, the grandeur of the structures remained intact, as if the thieves had managed to steal only the objects, never the presence of the place. Paro Taktsang. If you are afraid of heights, I would not recommend visiting this place in person. It remains attached to a vertical cliff more than 10,000 feet above sea level, as if it had been placed there by some impossible force. When the fog covers the Himalayan mountains, the structure disappears completely for a few minutes. Then it slowly returns, emerging through the clouds like a distant and almost unreal vision. The locals call the place Tiger's Nest, and the name originated from an ancient Buddhist tradition that has crossed centuries. According to stories preserved by monks, Guru Padmasambhava arrived at that cliff riding on the back of a winged tigress. It was there, inside the hidden caves of the mountain, that he supposedly meditated for months before introducing Tantric Buddhism to the region. The narrative blends spirituality, myth, and devotion in an inseparable way. The path leading to it requires a long climb along narrow trails surrounded by pine trees, prayer flags, and deep precipices. The thin air transforms every step into real physical effort, and perhaps that is exactly what makes the arrival so memorable. The place was not meant to be reached quickly. There is almost an involuntary ritual in the act of slowly ascending toward those suspended structures. Paro Taktsang is not impressive only because of its architecture. The greatest impact comes from the absurd location chosen for its construction. Any mistake during the building process could have sent workers falling down the mountain. Even so, during the 17th century, craftsmen built corridors, temples, and meditation rooms in an area where even standing upright already feels dangerous. The man responsible for constructing the main complex was Ngawang Namgyal, a religious leader known for unifying Bhutan during an extremely turbulent period. At that time, the country was fragmented by internal conflicts and external threats coming from Tibet. The monastery eventually became more than a spiritual space. It came to represent protection, cultural identity, and political resistance against the instability of the Himalayan region. The internal walls are covered with extremely detailed Buddhist paintings. Wrathful deities, spiritual symbols, colorful mandalas, and sacred scenes occupy nearly every available surface. Some images have been restored multiple times over the centuries, yet they still preserve ancient artistic techniques that survived thanks to the country's geographic isolation. Inside those corridors, the constant smell of yak butter and incense completely dominates the atmosphere. In 1998, a devastating fire destroyed important sections of the monastery. Ancient manuscripts, sculptures, and religious relics disappeared in the flames, while monks attempted to save sacred objects amid the fire. The tragedy deeply shook the population of Bhutan because Paro Taktsang is not merely a historical landmark. It holds an extremely powerful emotional place within the country's national identity. Monastery of Sumela. In the humid mountains of the Black Sea region in northern Turkey, a structure appears as if it had been pulled from an ancient dream and embedded against a massive stone wall. The monastery of Sumela rests hundreds of feet above a valley covered by dense forests, in a landscape where fog slowly rises among the pine trees, like cold smoke. The first impact of that place does not come only from the absurd height at which it was built, but from the feeling of absolute isolation. Everything around it feels disconnected from modern reality. The road disappears behind the mountains. urban sounds cease to exist, and the only constant noise becomes the wind passing through the damp canyon walls. The origin of the monastery stretches across centuries of historical uncertainty and religious legends that blend together until they become inseparable. According to traditions preserved by Orthodox monks, two Greek priests named Barnabas and Sophronius arrived in the region during the 4th century after receiving visions of the Virgin Mary. They believed that a sacred image painted by Saint Luke was hidden inside a cave in the mountain. Driven by this conviction, they established a small sanctuary on that remote cliffside. Over time, the structure slowly expanded, receiving new chapels, dormitories, corridors, and prayer spaces suspended above the abyss. The Byzantine Empire eventually financed part of the expansions, especially during the rule of Justinian, who encouraged renovations in several Eastern Christian centers. Centuries later, emperors of the Komnenos dynasty would transform Sumela into one of the most important religious sites in the Pontus region. The location ceased to be merely a spiritual retreat and began exercising political, economic, and cultural influence over entire communities near the Black Sea. It is difficult to understand how ancient civilizations accepted building in places that were practically inaccessible. The climb to Sumela remains exhausting even today, despite modern pathways and restored areas. Imagining workers carrying stone, wood, tools, and food across dangerous slopes during the Middle Ages creates a completely different perspective of the construction. There was absolutely no comfortable margin for error. One misstep meant falling hundreds of feet among the trees and rocks of the valley below. Even so, those men erected entire walls directly onto the mountain's irregular surfaces. Part of the structure appears literally suspended over empty space. Some windows open toward cliffs so deep that they cause immediate vertigo. Perhaps it is exactly this physical vulnerability before nature that makes the place feel so emotionally intense. The monastery does not dominate the mountain. It seems to survive through an extremely delicate balance between stone, faith, and human persistence. The interior paintings are among the most fascinating elements of Sumela. Byzantine frescoes cover walls and ceilings with religious imagery marked by deep colors, despite the damage caused by time and the region's constant humidity. Faces of saints, biblical scenes, and angelic figures silently observe every visitor who crosses those narrow corridors. Some images were vandalized throughout the 20th century, especially the eyes of the human figures, creating a disturbing appearance in certain rooms. There is something profoundly unsettling about observing ancient paintings mutilated by violence and historical intolerance. Even so, much of the artwork survived. The intense blue found in certain panels continues attracting attention in an impressive way, especially when natural light enters through the monastery's small openings. In some sections, the original mountain wall remains visible behind the frescoes, reinforcing the sensation that the structure was born directly from the damp cliffside rock. For centuries, Sumela received pilgrims from different regions of the Orthodox world. Monks copied religious manuscripts, preserved ancient texts, and maintained spiritual practices in relative isolation from major cities. The remote location helped both religious contemplation and protection against invasions and political conflicts that frequently affected that part of Anatolia. Even violent periods of the Ottoman Empire did not immediately destroy the monastery. Interestingly, several sultans allowed its continuation and even granted official protection to the religious complex. This reveals an interesting historical layer of the region. Despite tensions between Christians and Muslims throughout the centuries, there were also moments of pragmatic coexistence and agreements aimed at cultural preservation. Thridranga Lighthouse. In southern Iceland, we find a structure so improbable that many people believe it is digitally manipulated when they first see it. Thridranga Lighthouse occupies the top of a narrow volcanic formation surrounded by the North Atlantic in every direction. The rock rises from the sea like a black needle, constantly struck by violent waves and freezing winds. There is no nearby beach, safe harbor, or possible land route. Only rough water, grey skies, and a small white structure isolated above the void. The name Thridranga can be roughly translated as 3 stone fingers, a reference to the rocky formations extending out of the ocean along that extreme section of the Icelandic coast. For centuries, local fishermen avoided sailing near the area because of unpredictable currents and sudden storms. The sea in that region changes mood within minutes. During certain winter periods, waves reach absurd heights and explode against the rocks with enough force to completely cover parts of the cliff's lower walls. What makes it even more impressive is remembering that the lighthouse was built in 1939, at a time when helicopters were not yet being used for operations like that in Iceland. That means workers had to reach the rock by climbing directly up the vertical wall, soaked by the ocean's constant spray. The first climbers who reached the summit used extremely rudimentary techniques. They hammered metal bars into the volcanic rock while slowly advancing upward along the cliff. Later, they installed chains and improvised steps to allow the remaining workers to climb. It is difficult to imagine the level of tension involved in that process. The rock offers almost no large or stable surfaces. Practically every movement requires constant balance. In addition, Iceland's climate transforms any external surface into a slippery trap during much of the year. After they finally reached the summit, another almost absurd problem emerged: how to transport construction materials to that isolated piece of stone in the middle of the ocean. Wood, cement, equipment, and supplies had to be manually hoisted while boats attempted to remain near the rocks under extremely dangerous conditions. Many operations depended entirely on the behavior of the sea, and entire workdays could be cancelled because of sudden weather changes. Building anything there required almost irrational patience. The lighthouse's primary purpose was reducing maritime accidents in a region known for destroying ships. Iceland's southern coast has always been feared by experienced sailors. Hidden underwater rocks, intense fog, and brutal storms created a deadly combination for nighttime navigation. The small lighthouse became a vital reference point amid the darkness of the North Atlantic. Even though it appears tiny compared to the violence of the surrounding environment, its presence changed important maritime routes. Today, access to the summit occurs almost exclusively by helicopter. A metal platform was installed near the structure specifically to allow rapid landings under certain conditions. Many people imagine that a lighthouse keeper permanently lives at Thridranga, but that no longer happens in the romantic way portrayed in old films. The current system operates almost entirely through automation. Technicians periodically visit the site for equipment maintenance, structural inspections, and necessary repairs. Even so, remaining there for only a few hours already seems enough to create an intense sensation of psychological isolation. Moai of Easter Island. In the middle of the Pacific Ocean, An isolated island remained practically separated from the rest of the planet for centuries. Moai rise across the landscape of Easter Island like enormous silent figures watching over a volcanic fragment lost among thousands of miles of open water. Scattered throughout that remote territory are hundreds of gigantic statues known as moai. They remain motionless across dry plains and ancient volcanoes, as if still waiting for something that never happened. The first sensation when observing a moai up close is strange. Photographs cannot properly convey the scale of those sculptures. Some rise more than 30 feet tall and weigh dozens of tons. Their faces possess severe expressions, pronounced jawlines, and deep eyes turned toward the island's interior. Almost none of them are positioned facing the sea. That has always fascinated me because it suggests those figures were protecting the living rather than guiding navigators. The island's original inhabitants, known as the Rapa Nui people, likely began producing the moai between the 13th and 16th centuries. The sculptures represented important ancestors, spiritual leaders, and figures connected to the lineage of local tribes. For that society, the dead continued influencing the living even after physical death. The moai functioned as a permanent presence of ancestral authority spread throughout the landscape. Most of the sculptures were carved into the slopes of the Rano Raraku volcano, a place that resembles a graveyard of unfinished giants. Hundreds of statues remain partially buried within that volcanic quarry, some lying down, others tilted across the ground like petrified bodies interrupted in the middle of their creation. The great mystery was never simply who built the moai, but how they managed to move structures so heavy without modern technology. The island possessed no draft animals, efficient wheels, or advanced metal tools. Even so, enormous sculptures were transported for miles toward ceremonial platforms known as ahu. Numerous theories have attempted to explain this over the decades. Some researchers believe the Rapa Nui people used tree trunks to move the statues horizontally. Others defend an even more astonishing hypothesis. Ropes allowed the moai to walk slowly in an upright position through controlled rocking movements. Interestingly, modern experiments demonstrated that this method actually works under certain conditions. The idea of giant stone figures slowly crossing the island is almost unsettling. There is a rarely discussed detail about the moai that completely changes their original appearance. Many of them possessed eyes made from white coral and dark volcanic stone inserted into the sockets afterward. When those eyes were installed during religious ceremonies, it was believed the statue received mana, a kind of spiritual force connected to the ancestors. Without the eyes, the moai appear empty. With them, they would have gained an almost living expression. Some sculptures also wore red structures, called pukao, on top of their heads. These enormous pieces were made from another type of volcanic rock and probably represented ceremonial hairstyles or adornments associated with the local elite. Transporting those additional parts alone would already have been impressive. Even so, the Rapa Nui raised everything onto the gigantic statues using techniques that remain only partially understood. For a long time, European explorers created absurd theories regarding the origin of the moai. Some believed the local population lacked the intellectual capacity to construct something on that scale. Speculations involving lost civilizations, extraterrestrial visitors, and vanished continents eventually emerged. I have always found it curious how part of the world prefers inventing fantastic myths instead of accepting the ingenuity of ancient non-European peoples. Derinkuyu. Located in Derinkuyu, underground city appears discreet on the surface, surrounded by the arid landscapes typical of Cappadocia. Simple houses, quiet streets, and dry winds reveal nothing about the true secret hidden beneath the ground. But underneath that seemingly ordinary town lies a colossal labyrinth carved directly into volcanic rock. Narrow corridors descend dozens of feet into darkness, where thousands of people once lived, hidden during periods of war and persecution. The sensation inside Derinkuyu changes immediately as natural light disappears. The tight tunnels force visitors to bend down in several sections, while cold air slowly rises from the underground depths. In some areas, the silence becomes so intense that footsteps themselves sound unnaturally loud. The underground city possesses approximately 18 known levels, although only part of them are currently accessible. Archaeologists believe thousands of people could survive simultaneously within that hidden system. The most astonishing realization is that it was not merely an improvised shelter. Derinkuyu functioned as a complete city beneath the earth. There were dormitories, kitchens, communal areas, grain storage rooms, religious spaces, and even zones intended for raising animals. One of the complex's most impressive characteristics is its ventilation system. Hundreds of vertical channels cut through the rock, allowing constant airflow even in the deepest levels. Some of those shafts also served as access points for drinking water, making it possible for people to remain hidden for long periods without needing to reach the surface. The engineering involved feels far too advanced for the era when much of the structure was expanded. The first underground chambers were probably excavated by the Hittites thousands of years ago, but different civilizations expanded Derinkuyu over the centuries. Byzantine Christians transformed the site into a strategic refuge during Arab invasions and frequent religious conflicts in that part of Anatolia. Whenever enemy armies approached, entire communities vanished from the surface, almost without leaving traces. Above ground, villages appeared abandoned. Below it, thousands survived hidden in complete silence. The entrances could be sealed using enormous circular stone doors weighing hundreds of pounds. These structures functioned as extremely effective defensive barriers within the narrow corridors. Invaders attempting to enter would be forced to advance slowly through tight passageways, while defenders protected the labyrinth's interior. Some of those doors still remain in their original position, fitted into the tunnels exactly as they were centuries ago.